Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Beyond the Playbook, where we go beyond the game to explore the business, the diplomacy, and power moves shaping the world of sports. Today, we have with us a very interesting figure from the world of sports diplomacy and para diplomacy, Mr. Gavin Price. But before we start this conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. We've got plenty more game changing conversations coming your way. And while you're doing that, please do check out our previous interview with Mr. Jonathan Viceroy. Now let's dive in. So about Mr. Gavin Price, the head of Europe at the Sports Diplomacy Alliance, is a leading expert in sports diplomacy with 15 plus years of experience in international relations, public policy, and sport. He collaborates with governments and industry leaders to advance sports diplomacy initiatives and cultural exchange. Founder of Sports Diplomacy Unwrapped, Gavin explores emerging trends and has co-authored key research, including the British Council's Towards a Welsh Sports Diplomacy Strategy. He pioneered sports para-diplomacy, helping regions like Wales and the Basque Country engage globally through sport. A prolific writer and a media contributor, Gavin's work shapes the sports diplomacy discourse, bringing strategic vision and innovation to this field. Gavin, welcome to Beyond the Playbook. How are you?
Fantastic, thanks, Sai. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here today.
So, starting off, how would you describe sports diplomacy in your own words? And can you share a little bit about your journey and what inspired you to explore this unique field?
Sure, no worries. I guess I had to think about this. I suppose the seeds of my interest in sports diplomacy go all the way back to when I was a kid. So I found the names of overseas sports teams really evocative, really quite exciting. So names like Go Ahead Eagles, a football team in the Netherlands, or Lokomotiv Leipzig in Germany, or Kaiser Chiefs in South Africa, or Canberra Cosmos in Australia. They just seemed really, really exciting, and they were kind of portals into another world for a young person. And it led me to think about their sort of culture, their languages, geography, those kind of things. So sport was an enabler for curiosity. And I carried that on, I guess, through my life. I became an undergrad student. I started reading a lot more on the intersection of sport, politics, geopolitics, sport and culture, those kind of themes. There was a seminal book by a guy called Simon Cooper called Football Against the Enemy that really resonated strongly with me at the time. And I started working more broadly in conventional diplomacy. I worked for the UK government in international trade, and I just thought there's really something in this intersection of sport with conventional diplomacy, cultural relations, progressive agendas, and so much more. So I started just writing about what I called sports diplomacy. So I was one of the kind of, I guess, early thought leaders in the field. I did a master's degree at the University of London in global diplomacy, and my dissertation focused on Australian football diplomacy. So at the time, controversially, Australia switched from the Oceania Football Confederation into the Asian Football Confederation. So I looked at did Australia maximize the diplomatic benefits from that switch and kind of analyze those themes. And then that acted as a springboard to get into other work consulting. People enjoyed my thesis and those findings, and I sort of build on that. You mentioned in my bio the Towards a Welsh Sports Diplomacy Strategy document, which the British Council commissioned. That's kind of like an A to Z toolkit of how to do sports diplomacy, not only for small nations, although it does focus on small nations, but for any nations. And that really, I guess, created a footprint for me. So, that's led to many conversations with different clients and actors around the world, big and small governments. I've spoken in places like Australia, the US, Kosovo, Croatia, relating to that work. So I guess that's a kind of quick and dirty overview of my journey. Fast forward to today, I'm the director of Europe and the UK for Sports Diplomacy Alliance, which is an international consulting agency in sports diplomacy.
Yeah, that's interesting to know that your curiosity stemmed from the different names of teams, and then you moved on to your dissertation in how Australia switched its confederations. Yeah, that was a really interesting introduction.
Yes, for sure. And as you're probably aware, Australia is one of the kind of key nations that have been part of I guess, the modern journey of sports diplomacy. So I guess the timing of that research was really, really helpful. And of course, I was living in Australia at the time and contributing to that agenda.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that really helped. So, according to you, how do you think this field of sports diplomacy has evolved in the recent years?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. I think the sort of sweet spot for me at the moment is where sports diplomacy is fusing with things like digital and creative media, and how that also intersects with progressive agendas. And there are many agendas, anything from future generations to climate and sustainability to human security themes, or how we sort of intersect sport or sports diplomacy with enabling international trade, or even hard power diplomacy. But I do think that that fusion where digital is kind of fusing with those more of the soft power variables, so things like music, language, arts, those kind of things, is kind of really pushing positive and progressive agendas. That's really the emerging space for me. Sports diplomacy as it relates to hard power has been going on for many, many, many years, but that sort of, those themes are the emerging areas, if you like.
Right, yeah. And if what are some of the key successes or standout moments that you've witnessed where sports has had a very tangible impact in terms of diplomacy?
So I had to think about this, and I think there are, there are many, many, many examples. But for me, I think two key moments or two key events were the 1995 Rugby World Cup in South Africa, and the other one was the recent Women's Football World Cup hosted by Australia and New Zealand in 2023. So I think, in terms of the first example, South Africa, it really sort of signaled, I guess, post-apartheid South Africa's emergence back onto the world stage. I think, Mandela's, inclusive approach, where he, recognised essentially a very white South African or Springboks team at the time, and made it part of a sort of a national conversation, more inclusive, and then used that tournament, I guess, to bolster South Africa's profile, and to attract visitors, and to attract people to South Africa for positive reasons, was really impressive. And it's an example that still stands the test of time today. And if you fast forward to the current era, they're the number one in the world, arguably, in rugby union. And I think of a leader like Sia Kolisi, a black guy from a very humble background in South Africa. I mean, for me, he embodies all the traits of a modern sports diplomat. He's humble. He's an active listener. He's culturally aware. He's abreast of key emerging themes and progressive agendas. He's just a real magnet for inclusion, positivity. That to me is a real sort of, I guess, moniker or emblem for a progressive South Africa moving forward, if you like. The other example, I mentioned the Women's World Cup 2023 in Australia and New Zealand. I think, it was really important for many reasons. Obviously, women's professional sport has exploded on the world stage, but I think there were some really cool variables connected to this tournament. So first up was connected to my dissertation research I mentioned earlier. It was the first time that nations from two different football federations co-hosted a major tournament. So New Zealand OFC, Australia AFC. I think there's some really interesting diplomatic interchanges that help strengthen the trans-Tasman relationship between Australia and New Zealand, but also their presence in the wider Asia-Pacific region, which is becoming, it's a strategic sort of hot point in the world at the moment. There's a lot of influence in the world from China, the United States, even the UK, France has influence in that area. So those two acting as a unified force really help them as actors in that part of the world. But I think on a more progressive level, I thought it was really cool how that tournament really championed First Nations people in Australia, and also Maori people in New Zealand, their language, their culture. Okay, there's still a long way to go in reconciliation, particularly in Australia. But when I lived, down under for a long time, I couldn't really imagine the official names of the host venues being so. The city of Melbourne being called Nam, or Adelaide being called Tandanya, or Auckland, I think it was Tamaki Makaru or Makarau. My apologies to Mary speakers. I'm doing my best to appreciate your language, but you get my point. And also we had the flags of the Maori Nation, First Nations displayed at the venues. They had approval from FIFA and the other governing bodies to do this in the respective governments. I thought that really signified a big shift. And then, of course, the Matildas, the Australian women's national team, and they've now become the #1 supported team in Australia. I mean, if you think about that, that's mind blowing. 10 years ago, you would not have predicted that, right? When you think of the power of cricket or Australian rules football, rugby league, that's quite remarkable. So I think those two are two tangible examples or standout examples for me.
Yeah, I quite agree with you. I think the Rugby World Cup from 1995 was a pretty big example of sports diplomacy, especially considering how many years ago this happened, especially when the apartheid was quite prominent in South Africa. And I think also the 2023 World Cup, as you mentioned, was pretty significant in terms of um, showing respect to the First Nation people of Australia, the Maoris of New Zealand, and all the traditional welcoming ceremonies they had before each and every game in the two
Exactly,
locations. Yeah,
exactly.
and the I think the welcome speeches were also given by the heads of each of these nations as well. Yeah.
Absolutely a pivotal moment. And, just over the last few weeks, I don't know if you noticed, but Australia has just released its new official kit for the men's and women's team, which was commissioned. A sort of First Nations Australian was commissioned to do the design, and I think it's super cool, and it kind of really builds on this narrative and social inclusion and all these themes. And so I think football is starting to do a really good job. Rainbow football in Australia is starting to do a really good job in that space.
Yeah, I agree with you. Um, Now, coming to para diplomacy a little bit, can you elaborate on the concept of sports para diplomacy?
Yes, sure. So sports para diplomacy relates to the sports diplomacy of non-state actors, if you like. So sub-states like Wales, my native country, or the Basque Country, or Catalonia in Spain, or Puerto Rico over in the Americas, and many other actors. So non-state actors. So, but they may still be nations in their own right and significant administrations. It also relates to sort of major city municipalities doing sports diplomacy, or major regions, or even major clubs, or even coalitions of actors. So it's basically sports diplomacy done by non-state actors. I think in this space, those type of actors, particularly if you think about sub-states like Wales or Scotland or Catalonia, they tend to be, arguably more comfortable in their own skin and their own cultural nationhood, because they've needed to focus on those things to thrive and survive. So if you think of Wales, it has many MOUs, memorandums of understanding, and agreements with other sub-state actors, and also nation states as well. But sub-state actors like Brittany or the Basque Country, and they often do focus on pillars like sport and wider culture, but they're often very creative about how they fuse them. I think Wales in particular, and driven by a lot of the work I've done and other people have taken on board, it's been really clever in how it's fused all of its soft power assets creatively. So, as I mentioned earlier, things like music, gastronomy, language, heritage, history, geography, fuse them with sport to showcase itself on the world stage. I think, in this modern world, I think sometimes niche is different. It's exciting. It gives small nations a strategic value proposition. I mean, a lot of the work I did with the Basque Country, they're doing a lot of the stuff that Wales has done, but they have some really, really cool indigenous sports. So you can't not be excited by somebody, lifting a huge boulder on top of a mountain in the Basque Country. It just looks super cool. You think that's a cool place to visit. It looks culturally, it has a deep and meaningful culture. Or they have things like Estropadak, which is their sort of traditional boats or canoes where they have regattas. I think Basque pelota is an incredible sport. If you've never seen it, I encourage people to watch it, and it has a really, really interesting international footprint that people may not be aware of. So back in sort of the 70s and 80s, it was quite a big sport in the US. There was quite a large Basque diaspora. It still exists, but you had major arenas in places like Miami hosting these games, and they were insights into the Basque culture and helped it maintain, I guess, a profile beyond its shores, and obviously, creating its cultural or maintaining its cultural nation given that it is part of Spain. And, we know there have been some tensions in the past around its relationship with Spain. So I just think, a few points, it's about, sub-state actors who are doing creative things through sport to promote themselves, win friends, undertake diplomacy, and just act in their best interests. Simple as that.
Yeah, and how do you think local governments or smaller regions can, strategically use sports to amplify their global presence? Like, for example, the Wales women's national team is qualified for their first ever Euro tournament this
Yes.
year. So how do you think they can
Well,
probably use that platform?
yeah, so there's already some work underway in relation to that. So the Welsh Government has just made some announcements. So there will be I guess a grant offer available. I think off the top of my head it's £1 million, but we should check that. I can double check that for you this time. But really, it's about trying to. So in Wales, we take the view that nobody owns sport. So government can play a coordinating role. And yes, the Welsh Government has a sports diplomacy strategy. It's one of the few actually governments in the world, sub-state or state, that has an official sports diplomacy policy. But it plays a coordinating role. And part of that role is coordinating what we call the Team Wales or Team Cymru, which is the word in Welsh for Wales. The Team Cymru raft of stakeholders and players throughout the nation who can contribute. So that's everybody from different levels of government to civil society organisations. So organisations like Welsh Arts International or Museums Wales, through to people across the sportscape, so Football Association of Wales, Welsh Rugby Union, but also youth groups, other pillars of society. So Wales wants to pull on all of its levers, all of the people within the country to have a Team Wales approach. So that grant I mentioned earlier is basically the Welsh Government advertising to say, hey, Team Wales players, have you got any innovative or creative ideas about how we can use the platform of Wales women qualifying for their first major tournament at Euro 25 in Switzerland to promote Wales and Welsh culture and language and attract business, students, tourism to Wales? How can we use it as a magnet for Wales on the world stage? So there will be a bunch of creative bids going in. What I will say, to give you some tangible examples, it's a very similar model to what happened at the Qatar World Cup when the men's team were over there. I'll give you an example of one project. So during the Qatar World Cup, I mean, there were many things that happened. I mean, there was a Welsh festival of culture that happened around the world. So you saw music and cultural events and sports and trade events in places like Toronto and Washington and Dubai and Brussels and many other places. So there was a kind of a game watch party in Washington DC, where there were dignitaries and officials there, but it was also open to the public. And then later that evening, there was a nightclub takeover where Welsh DJs and US DJs played music just to celebrate the game that took place between Wales and US in the group stages of Qatar. If we look at sort of deeper culture, there's been a partnership that's been struck up between the Islamic Museum in Doha and also the National Museum of Wales, where they undertaking knowledge exchange They're helping to share staff and programs and ideas. There's no way that would have happened, or highly unlikely that would have happened without the prism of football and the World Cup and the program of events. So it's just I think it's a pretty cool example of how football can be a prism for wider international engagement.
Yeah, I think going back to what you said about the Welsh government and the initiative they've undertaken, I think that's a pretty good initiative. And I think the story about how the Welsh culture uh, was integrated into the FIFA World Cup in Qatar. I think that's also a very great example of sports diplomacy.
Thank you.
Um, yeah. Mm. Going back to something that we'd spoken about earlier, about Australia, they recently invested in PNG, Papua New Guinea's rugby, as part of their broader strategy to prevent the construction of the Chinese military bases in that region.
Yeah,
So how do you view this as an example of sports which is being used as a tool for hard diplomacy? And do you think this can
yeah.
be sustainable in the long term?
I think it's a fascinating example, and only time will tell whether it's successful as a hard or soft power, or even mixed value proposition. I think that, and I do think the Australian government is realizing this, and key partners within Australia, that, okay, there's no doubt that the driver has been Chinese influence in PNG and the wider Pacific region. But I think there's a sort of growing understanding that it also needs to be there for other positive regions. I mean, Australia has huge Pacific Islander diasporas, who are economic migrants, some are, Australian citizens, some are, second, third generation, Pacific Island Australians, if you like. So I think they're starting to learn that, if we can offer more positive things as part of this relationship, so through sports, so if we can help them develop their sports infrastructure, their sports science, their coaching. You've seen recently some of the age grade teams in both rugby union, football, and other sports, when they go out to places like PNG or other Pacific Islands, like sort of Vanuatu, Fiji, New Caledonia, places in this neighborhood, they're not just going there to play games. So I've seen that, the young Matildas, that, the age grade Matilda teams have been playing maybe Fiji, but they'll train with their Fijian counterparts during the week. They'll have a competitive game, which both nations want to win, but it's more about, gaining insights into culture, and they'll do some cultural immersion visits during the week, visiting sites of, cultural interest, and just sharing culture and ideas at a younger age. So I do think, to be fair to the Australian government, it is a two-tiered strategy, but I'm not for 1 minute suggesting, would the actual approach be funded to the level it is without the sort of security worries connected to China and other variables in the region? Let's be honest, probably not. But I do think there is a bigger picture here, and we need a balanced argument about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I get your point.
Yeah.
Um, Moving on to athlete activism, you've researched athlete activism's role in human rights, right? So how do you think athletes balance being sports diplomats while also advocating for social causes?
Sure, it's a $1 million question, and I wish I had a definitive answer for you, but I'll give you some thoughts on this for sure. So I think obviously it depends on, whether an athlete is co-opted by a state, a foreign affairs ministry or another government agency, or they're representing an official body, maybe FIFA, UEFA, or the IOC, or whoever it may be, or are they acting independently for a cause that they're interested in, or with a collective of athletes who may be friends or colleagues, in the professional sporting realm. Obviously, if they're acting for governments in particular, it's tricky because they've been co-opted. They're probably on the payroll in some shape or form, or getting some kind of remuneration or travel. So they're probably limited by the government's messaging, the government's strategic objective in sports diplomacy and wider international engagement. What I will say is that I've seen good and bad examples of this in the past. I've seen more bad than good, but I think things are improving. Often, athletes, they may have been wonderful athletes, world record holders, or esteemed players in whatever sport they've come from, and they may be great communicators on the field. They may be media trained, but is the government really briefing them on their remit? What do they want them to achieve? They're often sent into formal context, and they've not been trained, and we can come on to that in a minute. So I think there's that point, that sort of formal area. There's certainly some work that needs to happen about how athletes are trained to be diplomats. I think they need to have some training in the pillars of conventional diplomacy. So, negotiation, communication, representation skills. Do they understand truly the international society of sport and how that interlinks with politics, geopolitics, wider culture, other agencies? How does it interlink with the UN or WADA or the European Union or ASEAN or wherever it may be? Where are these agencies? I mean, for some people, these agencies are double Dutch. Does the average person on the street really understand the UN? I'd argue probably not. They have a general idea. So putting them in formal context, they do need some training, and we're trying to do some work in that space. But if they're acting independently off their own bat, I think, the training stuff still applies. But I think, they're often specialized in a cause. So, are they interested in, I don't know, bullying or climate sustainability or mental health or any number of other causes? So I think if they're going to put themselves out there above the parapet, particularly on social media, they really need to, do some research. They really need to understand what they're talking about if they're going to go into bat for those causes, because the media is ruthless. They will be questioned, and I think we have seen examples where maybe people have come a cropper, but where people are really acting with good advice and they know what they're talking about, we've seen some great outcomes. So I think of somebody like Marcus Rashford, the Manchester United player, although he's just gone to Aston Villa. But his outcomes with sort of addressing child poverty and making sure that young vulnerable people in England got access to school dinners and things like that was a great example of how an athlete who has a great platform, is slick, gets great advice, and knows this stuff can influence the agenda. And I think you can even take it up then to another level. You think of somebody like Megan Rapinoe, in the United States, done so much work for equal pay in football and other sports in the US and internationally, but also social inclusion more widely. So yeah, I think there's a need for to sum up for training, and there's a need for fusing their skills they've learned as athletes. So leadership, discipline, and many other things. Fusing them with how they operate, on social media, conventional media. How do they present themselves? How do they manage their media campaigns, and so much more. I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also another example would be the Lionesses. Right after they won the Euros, they immediately penned a letter to the government asking for more access to children for sports in schools.
A
So
brilliant example. And I was performing some sports diplomacy there because I was a Welshman who actually went to that final and felt like I had a bit of imposter syndrome. But no, I was very, very happy for our neighbours at the time and what it meant for women's sport in the UK and internationally. I think the Lionesses are a fantastic example. So good on them.
yeah. Um, like, how do you envision the future of sports diplomacy evolving, especially with increasing global connectivity through digital platforms? Like you mentioned, how it's evolved now, digitally,
Sure.
especially.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that area is the kind of key emerging theme for me. I mean, it's no secret that technology is moving at a crazy pace. It can be an enabler for so much positive sports diplomacy. But I think I mentioned earlier, and Wales has done some cool work in this space. And I don't mean to always revert back to Wales. It's just I've been heavily involved there, although I do work with many other stakeholders, governments around the world also. But I think, it is one of the leaders in this area where digital and creative media fuses with sport to promote a nation, its people, and its culture. So a really cool example I like to give is the national football teams of Wales. Every time they play an international match on the world stage, they create these beautiful digital posters which showcases Wales and the nation they're playing and the unique relationships. So the send-off game for the US women's national team before they went to the 2023 World Cup was between Wales and the US, and it was a big deal for Wales to be invited because there was a lot of fanfare and send-off. But the poster itself was really cool. So it had a picture of Jess Fishlock, who is one of the most decorated international women's players, but she captains Wales. She's an icon of the game. She plays for Seattle Reign in the States. She's played with people like Rapinoe and many of the big stars. Basically, there's a sort of beautiful drawing of her surfing into California in a Wales shirt on a surfboard, and there's other kind of iconography. So just kind of having a bit of fun and painting both places in a fun light and saying, hey, we're coming to play you. This game is about fun. It's about inclusion. These are some of the things we love about California. The game was in California and the States, and these are some things we love about Wales. And every game does something different, cool and unique. I mean, the women's team recently played Italy and Monza. Monza is one of the homes of Formula One racing. So I had a picture of a car which had like Italian and Welsh colours on it, and a Welsh and Italian player in the car. But people, it might sound a bit cringeworthy, but people love this stuff because it's fun. And the posters are done by a professional digital artist, and people buy them and they love to put them up. So that's a great example. But I think more fast moving is the kind of the video and digital media space. Again, I think Wales has done some super cool stuff in that place that speaks to its kind of values of inclusion. So the campaign around the Qatar World Cup was kind of it was called kind of like "Come On In," but basically it was a montage of various very normal people from around Wales, celebrating random things about Wales, its culture, its landscape, its history, with a message of "Come on in, you're all welcome." The video was bilingual, so it cleverly used bite-sized Welsh, but mostly English to market Wales. And that's something what, has helped, I guess, Wales and its brand differentiate itself to say, hey, we do have our own language, and it's kind of cool. And we want to showcase it through sport. So I think you're seeing a lot more creativity around that. A colleague of mine is an individual called Lindsay Krasnoff. She's from the States. Does a lot of work internationally in sports diplomacy, but one of her key focuses at the moment is the US-French relationship. And I think if you look at Lindsay's work, she's done some really cool storytelling around that. So showcasing links between France and the US as it relates to sport, especially basketball. There are a number of high-profile French players in the NBA at the moment, and the game is growing rapidly. And the NBA has hosted games in Paris and so on. So I think that space is fast-moving, and we're seeing creative stuff every day come out through video and activism and everything in between. So that was a bit of a ramble, but hopefully it gives you a picture of where I think things are heading.
No, I think that was a pretty good example, especially the efforts done by Wales and the different teams to promote its culture whenever possible, and through gestures that might seem small, like through the online promotions of certain games in other countries as well. But it certainly brings curiosity and brings a lot of eyeballs towards the country.
Sure things, and we're coming from a small place like Wales, which it's a confusing entity. It's part of the UK, so sometimes people outside of the UK don't understand there are constituent nations and all these things. But a sort of social media post featuring somebody like Gareth Bale or Jess Fishlock, that can do more for Wales than any number of campaigns that the nation can dream up. So we've been really creative in making sure we use some of our athlete icons, and there were a number of athlete ambassadors that were out in Qatar, and there'll be more out in Switzerland in the summer. And they're not just from sport, Probably half of them will be from sport. So people like Professor Laura McAllister, who's also on UEFA's executive committee, which is a super big deal for a small nation like Wales. Helps us profile on the world stage. But you also see things like celebrity chefs and DJs and musicians as part of the wider Team Wales team, showcasing all of its soft power attributes, but with football and the tournament being the key hook.
Yeah, that's a great point. So as we move towards the end of this conversation, for individuals and organizations, uh, particularly young individuals, eager to enter the sports diplomacy space, what advice would you offer?
Yeah, sure. So I think I did jot down some points on this. So I think, the key points for me is, and some of them are really obvious when you think about it. I mean, they would apply to most sectors. But the first one is network actively, actively build your networks, reach out to people. But obviously, when you reach out to people, it's good to be clear on what you want, and if there's something you can help them with, or it's something in it for them, so it can be a reciprocal arrangement. I think you'll find that people are very nice, and if they'll try to find time to help you, particularly if you're a young and emerging leader and you do it in a professional and respectful way. I think that's really, really important. I think reading widely is super important. There are now a few hundred academic journals that relate to sports diplomacy out there. You will see plenty of publications. I would, without going back to Wales, if you're interested in sports diplomacy, have a look at the British Council research report, which I researched and wrote with Dr. Stuart Murray, called Towards a Welsh Sports Diplomacy Strategy. The reason why I say that is it's basically a model blueprint of how to do sports diplomacy from A to Z. Yes, it's in a paradiplomatic sub-state context, but the key pillars would apply to even a major nation about how you do sports diplomacy. It's very readable. It's got some cool history. It's glossy. It's a beautiful thing to read. It's interestingly, I get involved in many projects all over the world, but that is the one project I get asked the most about, and I think mainly because it is really the only tool out there that sort of sets out in writing how to do sports diplomacy from A to Z. So look it up. So read widely. But I think, look, be bold, get involved. No one owns sports diplomacy. It's a fast and rapidly moving space. Write about it. If you've got an opinion, write about it. Write an article on LinkedIn, or I've got my own Substack site, Sports Diplomacy and Rap, where I try to give insights and ideas on emerging themes in sports diplomacy. So if there's something you want to write about, I mean, the strength and weakness of sports diplomacy. More a strength than a weakness is that, where does it begin and end? It's everything from, as you mentioned earlier, hard power things like sport and international security and trade, through to, real progressive agendas like social inclusion. And then when you throw in nation branding and many, many other things, there are literally thousands and thousands of things you could write to relating to sports diplomacy. There is the opportunity to specialize and I guess diversify. So in the future, I can see a place where there are, and they technically exist already, where people who are specialists in sports diplomacy and human rights, or sports power diplomacy, or sports diplomacy and sustainability, just like there are specialists in conventional, diplomacy. Somebody might be interested in, I don't know, nuclear proliferation, or they might be interested in, the the EU's relationship with Ukraine and Russia, or whatever it may be. Those people exist. So you can specialize and create your own niche. I think, look, understand it all with an understanding of conventional diplomacy. So, undertake training, read up. If you can undertake roles in maybe international trade or diplomatic areas, or with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that will stand you in good stead for sports diplomacy. So you need to understand conventional diplomacy, but you also need to understand the international sports landscape and international society of sport. And that's not just about, being really interested in, I don't know, German football or Japanese rugby. It's really understanding, key institutions. I mentioned earlier, how does the UN interact with sport? what does WADA do? Why does Australia have a sports diplomacy strategy? Why do France and the US have a relationship through sport? What's in it for them? I think you really need to develop a really, really deep interest. So I think you pull all that together, then you've got a strong chance. Trying to find a job in sports diplomacy these days, it's not that they don't exist, but there's not many of them around. You won't jump on Google and Google, sports diplomacy consultant or, sports diplomacy program lead. I've only ever seen a handful of those jobs. They do exist in places like Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, certainly the State Department in the US. The UK government has a few people that kind of specialize in sport, but they tend to be more across all soft power levers. But those jobs are going to be uber competitive. There's a niche amount, so you need to think about maybe creating your own role. So you need to be smart about how you gain experience. So maybe if you go and work for a sports federation as their international partnerships lead, you will be doing some form of sports diplomacy. You will be negotiating, you will be dealing with contracts, you will need to understand bilateral relationships and what it means for overseas partners and diverse partners. So be smart about how you build those those career blocks, and then eventually I think you can put it all together and say, hey, I'm a sports diplomacy expert, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. Those were all great pieces of advice, especially considering how sports itself is say growing globally. Like how in different sports, different countries are now trying to increase their reach by trying to host events and trying to enter into the foray. So I think those were all great
So,
pieces.
I do think we will see more designated roles, certainly in government, and I think peak sport bodies at places like your UEFA's, your FIFA's, World Cricket, World Rugby. I won't be surprised to see sports diplomacy people. In fact, World Rugby has those people. They might call them different things, and as I mentioned earlier, all the organisations have some kind of international team, international officer, program management. They're effectively doing sports diplomacy. I mean, I was involved with a project recently. So an expert called Ashley Huffman, who used to head up the sports diplomacy division at Department of State in the US, but is now a consultant expert like myself. Ash was working with State to help out the Ukrainian government to help Ukraine build its sports diplomacy capacity. So we were helping build competencies with some of their key administrators in their football federation, their National Olympic Committee, and also within their government. So when they went to major events like the recent Paris Olympics and Paralympics, they could be going into bat for the Ukraine and using sport to leverage strategic outcomes. So you will see more and more programs of that nature where even if they may not be designated sports diplomacy people, jobs will involve sports diplomacy within governments and other agencies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely that does. So I think that ends our conversation today. Thank you so much, Gavin. That was wonderful. We touched on a lot of different areas of sports diplomacy, and I think it was a really insightful conversation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was wonderful to speak with you. And if this prompts any questions from yourself or people who tune into this video, then feel free to reach out. You can find me pretty easily on LinkedIn, and I'm sure you guys could share my details. I'm always happy to chat and engage. So thanks a lot, and have a fantastic day.
You
Diolch
too.
yn fawr. Diolch yn fawr.